Junot and I are physically fucked up. He's standing because he has a terrible back issue, and I've had a shoulder issue, so we're fine pair tonight. But we're going to make it a lot of fun for you, and I wanted to say this in front of Junot because it will embarrass him and thus relax him. Among the many, many things I wish I could do, I wish I could write a story like Junot Diaz, because his stories contain so much. You don't know where they start and where they begin, like nature. But in the end, I don't want to write a Junot Diaz story because I want Junot to write his own stories, tales that are so emotionally specific, everyone can relate to them, even if they aren't Dominican or straight or doing crazy things in love. I hate hackneyed terms like universal, but in Junot's case, it's true. He's a universal writer, or more specifically, a universalist. He wants to see people as they are and as they relate to other people. But he's also a poet who likes the miniature situation that speaks volumes. In 1996, Junot published his landmark collection, Drown, and then in 2007, he published his first novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, and in 2012, he published This Is How You Lose Her, his second collection of stories. I am grateful for all these works, and I am grateful for Junot's friendship and humor and politics and commitment and acknowledgement that we're all sort of off. It's what we do with our difference that matters, and with that, Junot has done a great deal. Ladies and gentlemen, Junot Diaz. Junot, I thought I'd get to something that I think reviewers who are generally hemmed in by political correctness tend to avoid in your work, and that's the pato. I'm a pato, and I don't feel demeaned, and I don't feel demeaned or criticized by this epithet in your work since I come from the same world. Can you talk to us a bit about the machismo in your culture and what it may or may not be an expression of?
Yeah, thank you, Hilton. First, I want to thank the Strand for having us, yes. And I wanted to thank Hilton for taking time off from an incredibly busy schedule. Anybody who reads The New Yorker knows this dude does all the work over there. And, you know, 2/3 of the brain of the whole fucking operation, so it's wonderful to have him here, and thank you all for coming out in this absolutely miserable evening, you know, for real. I was like, guys, thanks a lot, honestly. I met some people coming up. I'm always so embarrassed whenever I have to do a public event. I met some people coming up the elevator, and I just wanted to kind of like hide, apologize for dragging them out. And I think the question is a foundational one. Certainly was important to me. I always thought it was really interesting because, you know, part of, I guess, when I think about the political unconsciousness of masculinity, it's queerness. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the first book I ever wrote was kind of a first essay, kind of a first pass at a specific kind of masculinity. And so I thought, like, aha, I'm going to name the book after the queerest story in the collection. And from everything I've seen, I don't think a single critic ever mentioned it in any popular publications.
I didn't see it.
It was absolutely absent, you know? It was like weird. It's like, it was just such an obvious lacuna. So, you know, I think that it's something that I'm deeply interested in. I mean, the project continues in Oscar Wilde. I mean, you don't got to be a scholar to see Oscar as a very queer subject, you know? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I just think it's so important because it's like I can't imagine, I can't imagine masculinity without its sort of tissue that it uses to prevent itself from thinking about its own queerness. Right. I mean, masculinity comes with a beard attached, right, so that it could pretend everything that it's doing is really, really straight. And I just, as an artist, I really was interested in that and how it plays itself out, especially in the kind of culture that I grew up. Again, my Dominican culture is no one else's, guys. I grew up in an absolutely tiny, granularly particular place and time with a particular set of people. There's no universalizing claim to my Dominicanness, and I hope people get that shit, you know? And the Dominican culture that I came up with, of which there's probably 22 billion of them, yeah, of separate cultures going on simultaneously, you know, this was such a present discussion that it would just felt like, as an artist, I'd be like a real fucking lame ass if I kind of didn't jump into it.
I remember, I mean, one of the reasons that the question came up for me was when we were having Chinese food around Christmas time, and you were showing me pictures of friends you had visited in DR, and there was just a table of queens. And I said, oh, those queens look so nice. Are they your friends? And you said, well, kind of my only friends down there, because they can do sensitivity, and then they can also play into the culture at the same time. It was a great discussion that we were having about, it was a kind of drag, right? Masculinity as a kind of drag.
No, without any question. I mean, without any question. And I think you take that on in the new book you've coming up. There's aspects of that as well, and the way you race it too. I think that in this case, especially with my life in Santo Domingo, you know, there's these kind of performative, hyper-masculine spaces where you can't have an openly gay friend. Yeah? That's the rule. Of course, the point is you're supposed to break all that shit. You know, in Santo Domingo is this one place, like where I grew up in New Jersey, you know, my particular neighborhood in Santo Domingo, if you're, you know, if people think, oh, you're hanging out with somebody you're hanging out with a queen, they're going to be like, oh, you're gay.
Right.
And it's a way to kind of patrol this very actively. And the same thing was in New Jersey. It was like this kind of, the homosocial was okay as long as we called it straight. Right? It's like, it's okay that you can sort of just get naked and wrestle with your boys, but that shit was like called a sport. Like, that's all right. And, you know, DR brings it, for me, my life in Santo Domingo makes it kind of really, really explicitly, because I think what you're saying is very true. I feel like there's the friends that I have down there who sort of have borne the full wrath of a culture. For me, I tend to be more interested in discussing things in explicit terms. You know, I don't know about any of you guys. If you're an artist, the least helpful friends are people who say, I don't think there's racism. I mean, it's okay that they're your fucking family members.
Right.
I mean, that sounds like my entire family. They're like, racism? I just don't like niggers, you know?
Right. Right.
That's all right. I mean, you can't fucking disown your family in the ways you should be able to. But it's...
Right. You know, but also, I mean, one of the things to support what you're saying, and I know it's a phrase that often makes me uncomfortable when I hear it or read it. We've talked about this, but it's indigenous to that culture. I remember my brother is very light-skinned, and my West Indian grandmother would say, Hilton, get out of the sun. You've had enough. Now, this Bajan culture and Dominican culture in terms of the color scale can be deeply wounding if you don't realize, and it took me many years of growing up and thinking that this was some internalized craziness that had happened. Throughout your books, they're always talking about the color scale. In fact, there's a story, How to Date a blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I don't know, that I can't quote the whole title. Who cares?
We got it.
But I think that one of the things that is so brave about you is saying it and then letting the characters illustrate it.
And you know, we come from cultures, just from, because I know Hilton, I'm not jumping to conclusions about some abstract culture of Hilton's. I know Hilton's, we come from sort of backgrounds where people in some ways were echo chambers for a lot of the kind of cultural, racial sort of defaults. So people would say wild things explicitly. And I just thought it would be like kind of a big, again, it would just be such a lame cop-out if my characters weren't half as frank as my uncles. You know, and I always say my...
like your tia one of the T is grabbing one of the characters' balls by way of introduction.
Yeah, man. I've gotten more emails about that from dudes I know who are like, yo, my aunt's grabbed my balls too. And I'm like, dudes, it takes a village. It takes 5 genders. It takes 5 genders to raise this particularly malevolent form of masculinity that we tend to produce so, like, efficiently.
Yes.
You know? And I just think that, you know, it was just interesting for me because I had a parent, listen, I don't give a fuck. You could take 2 people who look identical in skin color, and my mom can distinguish with them at the molecular level. My mom will be like, that motherfucker's lighter. And I don't give a fuck. Everything that we've lost in America, all the kind of vocabulary we've lost in America to talk about race is very omnipresent in the Caribbean.
Yes.
You know, I mean, we've lost so much vocabulary to talk about race. We don't even have a conversation about race, and we've lost it. And yet, in the Caribbean, there's at least 12 terms for people, just that I could come up with my mind, for people's skin color in the neighborhood I grew up in. And I think that this, in some ways, is useful because it helps when it comes time to approach questions of privilege. People don't claim amnesia.
Right.
You know, people can think of people like my uncles as super backwards because they didn't go to fucking Ivy League schools, but they don't cop to any of that ridiculous liberal amnesia. Oh, it's not race, it's class. I'm like, motherfucker, you can't have class without race.
Right.
It's called coloniality, you know? Right. But these people that they called, you know, that they would just come right off the bat and be like, oh, this guy's ignorant. My uncles would never make those claims. They're like, yes, it's about black people.
Right.
You know, and it's that level of frankness. For all we claim about it, that we say it's regressive and messed up, I'm sorry, that's a better starting point than the constant elision of the sort of liberal moment we have now.
But do you think that that is why the critical discourse around your work hasn't been as substantial as the work itself?
I mean, again, it's like Hilton Als. It's like talking about, like, it's always weird. It's like talking about, like,
relatives you haven't met yet.
And also just weird, it's like when I listen to, I have these great cousins, and they're like, yo, I should have better looking chicks than I do. I hear them say this, I'm like, oh shit. That's like a weird statement to make, you know? It's like, oh, I should have better critics than I do. I mean, you know, being
You can have better girls and better critics.
Oof. Yeah, I think for most straight men, the problem isn't that we don't have women worth us. The problem is that we're like, have women 10 times worth us. But the thing is I think the question you're saying is, as far as I think of people of color in this country as artists, I think in general, whenever I read work about people of color as artists, it is so overly simplified. Right. We tend to be reduced to the cultural element. Yeah, so somebody will like trot out a Spanish word to describe, I mean, how many reviews do I got where a non-Spanish speaking person will trot out a Spanish word to attempt to describe what the fuck I do? It's like watching people who can't dance salsa dance salsa. It's like, or we'll be reduced to, you know, simplistic visions of, you know, oh, these works of art, this artist is talking about this crucial moment, we're talking about the problematic of race. Right. They'll use these terms that mean nothing because they don't want to approach what exactly a person is getting at in their work. And the reason they don't want to do this is because part of the problem is, again, if white artists were discussed along racial terms as often as people of color, we would be a better country for it. I mean, I never see a white dancer discussing how their whiteness impacts their dance. You know? I never see any white artist, the first question out of an interview is mine, have you experienced racism? But as an artist of color, it's incredible. It's incredible the amount of times these questions get asked. I'm always like, whenever I get like a white interlocutor who asks me, have you experienced racism? I'm like, have you been racist lately? I don't know. There's stuff that's going on, but again, I think that one of the best things about art, as anyone who's ever studied a Victorian text knows, is that all of us, the future comes faster than we imagine, right? And there is a future coming up of young artists and young critics and young scholars who are thinking in ways that make the current conversations about our art and our scholarship look incredibly just reductive.
You know, it's very interesting that you go to this idea of coming up in time, because we've had several conversations about time travel, and you were talking about one of the reasons that you liked and loved science fiction by people like Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany was because they were talking about time travel, that literally you have gone from a slave culture to talking to hundreds of people at the Strand bookstore. How does that happen? So that time travel element of being 1 or 2 generations away from the characters in your books who are living below subsistence level to this, how does that affect you as Junot?
And how do you narrativize it? I mean,
right.
I always think of that question. I mean, how do you narrativize being in squint range of, you know, I'll sit at my Christmas table and I'm in squint range of my grandmother, who basically grew up in a proto-medieval kind of almost slavery sort of background in the Dominican Republic, you know, working as a tenant farmer, just this terrifying kind of subsistence. And I'm like squinting at her at one eye, and then I'm squinting at my little brother, who's US born, a Marine combat veteran, who sounds like someone turned the TV to Fox Channel and broke the dial, you know? And I'm thinking, how do we narrativize?
That was fucking funny, Junot.
Oh,
yeah.
We'll smoke about it later.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we narrativize it? And what you're asking, I think, is how do you create a self that takes both of those people in?
Who can stand it?
Yeah, takes both of them in.
How do you stand it? Like, how do you physically and emotionally take it? Because you've catapulted yourself through artistry into another realm. This goes back to the time travel metaphor.
Well, I think you know, it's really helpful for people to assemble selves, not always deploying realism.
Right.
You know, like, this is true. Like, realism cannot account for my little brother and my grandmother. But Octavia Butler's science fiction can. You know, Samuel Delany's sort of generic experiments can explain them. Like, I read books of Samuel Delany, and that range is present. Not only present, but the unbearable, you know, what is unbearable about trying to hold the two together in one place. And so I think that even as a person like me, it helps not to have exclusively realism as the only paradigm to understand yourself.
Right.
You know?
Do you think that the last story you published in the New Yorker, Monstro, do you think that that was a moving towards a surrealism that explained things better than you felt you had before?
Oh man, I kind of like wish I'd had about 4 more years on that story. I was on deadline.
No, it was amazing.
Thank you, but honestly,
can we just support him in
Well,
Monstro if you guys read it?
No,
I mean it. I mean it.
But no, but I think it's better to sit 4 extra years on any piece. It's better that way. I think they're different approaches.
I want you to get paid, though.
Okay.
Okay.
Hilton keeps it, you know. Hilton will keep you in insurance, you guys. Which, considering how most of our artists end up, is not a bad push.
Right.
You know, the applause today, toothless with no insurance tomorrow.
Right.
No, it's true. We have a wonderful way of doing this. You know? So I do think it's not, I wouldn't say an advanced, but it was more like trying to see if what would it look like if I was more explicit about not using realism? Where with my novel, Oscar Wilde, I sort of obscured how little the genre of realism is deployed in the novel. I sort of hid it, you know? I think someone can read Oscar Wilde and be completely convinced they've read a realistic novel with a couple eruptions of like, oh yeah, these weird moments, but fuck it, I don't give a fuck about talking mongooses, you know? This shit was a novel. In this case, I kind of want to see if it's possible to get similar effects without obscuring the pedigree.
Right.
I felt like Oscar Wilde was like it's like that octoroon cousin of yours who doesn't pass for white, but they don't deny it when people treat him real well. You know? So, see if I could take that, like you say, take the drag off, see what happens.
I was wondering about that in terms of when you say pedigree. When you began writing your first fiction, did you know, or was it a process of discovery that you were going to focus on your particular world? And I'm wondering why modern writers of color and Philip Roth are particularly drawn to that pedigree. It's a great word.
Part of it was, I came up as a young activist. Again, I mean, first of all, like, how many Latinos are here? Yeah? What's up? Dominicans? Here. Sure, right? Oye, pero qué bueno verlo. Oh, hi, negra. Oh my God, I didn't see you there. So, yeah, and I don't know how many of you guys like were in your college Latino organizations. You know, if you had a Lalsa, or if you had a Lucha, or if you had a Salsa, or if you had an LAL, or an LAO, or whatever the fucking organization. I was in all those organizations. And I was a young activist, and that's basically who I was all through college. That was my identity. It continues to be, in many ways, my default identity. Like when I wake up, you know when you wake up and you don't know what room you are or country you're in? The one thing I always know is I'm like, fight the man, you know? I'm just like, get him, get him, you know? So where it came from, my concepts of what I was gonna write about came from being the reason they're trying to shut down all the ethnic studies programs. They're trying to shut down all the ethnic studies programs in this country, yeah, because they don't want to produce students like they produce out of ethnic studies programs who begin by saying, yo, it's fucked up we're not talking about us.
Right.
And I think I'm a product of these programs, and they're the ones who aimed me directly towards writing about this tiny bullshit neighborhood that nobody really kind of knew or thought about when I was growing up. And I just, you know, it's an old pattern, but one that's super reliable. You know, you think we're so erased. I mean, you know this. It's like, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, if you're from a poor family, if you're from like a rural family, if you're from like a family who work like dogs and never got any respect or a share of the profits, you know that 99% of your stories ain't been told in any fucking medium. And so, and yet, we still have to be taught to look and to tell our stories. For many of us, that's something that we have to like stumble our way through. You know, it's despite the utter absence of us, it's still an internal revolution to say, wait a minute, we are not only like worthy of great art, but the source of great art. For many of us, it takes a lot of work to get there.
Kara Walker told me that it takes many hours when she goes into the studio to claim it, to claim the space, to say that it's okay for her to make art. Just going back to what you were saying, I'd like to, if you can, describe the process and the stumbling. Did you feel that fiction would be the genre, or were you working in other kinds, were you writing in other kinds of genres?
No, I always did fiction. I always wanted to write. I belong to, again, all of us who've had, all of us who were aware of their parents' infidelities. When you're young, if you're aware of that, you have this kind of your cosmology begins with this concept that your parents are real big liars. You know, like my cosmology begins with this constant deception. And so, of course, I always wanted to write about deceivers, people who were wearing masks. And fiction felt more useful simply, it was like, I was that literal as a kid. I was like, I live fiction, let me write fucking fiction, you know? So it started there, and it seems it's going to end there. I was always terrible in essay form, whether it's confessional or critical, because in essay form, you can't, the whole thing can't be a lie, right? Like my idea of an essay would be to write about a book that's never been written, or like to draw a complete ridiculous conclusion. And when everybody checks the footnotes, the problem is with essay,
something Borgesian like that.
The thing with nonfiction is people will just be like, you're full of it, dude. The lie shows up really quick. Unless you work for the Times, it's like it's hard to just constantly produce. Well, you know what I mean. Once you get under the fence, people think like, oh, well, the rubric itself gives you a certain amount of room to lie. But I think in fiction, I could lie on multiple levels, which is always what my family felt like. So I felt at home. You know?
Were there stories that you didn't, that were just sort of working out before you got to the stories in Drown?
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, I had so many absurd stories. I had so many absurd stories, I still hadn't mapped out what it meant to, for example, it seems silly, you guys, I just didn't know how to scale living in central New Jersey. I lived in central New Jersey. We were the first Dominican families in the area. We grew up around a predominantly African-American community with like some poor whites, and most of them were Irish immigrants. So my concept of like Republican was not political party. When I hear Republican, just from my childhood, my first thought is like, yeah, home rule. You know, like real Irish political shit. And I couldn't figure out how to scale that, you know, and how to scale a family that existed in this really dense Dominican world at home, but then was like passing for black out in the rest of the world.
Right.
You know, like I had siblings who were phenotypically black. They didn't look like me. I wasn't like, you know, terrorism act bait. They like looked African American. And so I couldn't figure out a way to scale it, you know? And so my first fictions, they all sounded like I was living in New York City, which is a very different world, because I was reading so many New York writers describing the Latino experience in New York in a really urban setting. And so it just...
People like El Magro Proto, or what were you thinking of?
People like, if you guys know Edward Rivera, who wrote Family Installments, probably one of the greatest memoirs is Family Installments. Again, if you want to know how I wrote my first book, you read Family Installments, because I just completely copied that book, you know? And then some of the more classic folks, Nicolás Amor was a very big person. Even though she was writing about Patterson, it still had a much more urban edge. And then Piri Thomas, folks like that. Yeah, those first 30 or 40 pieces were just... I feel like in my first 30 or 40 pieces of writing, a character was always robbing a bodega. Like, it was so stupid. Like, no, for real. It was like I was an embarrassment to my own self, you know? And I started out writing film scripts.
I never knew that.
Yeah. Before I said fiction, but I wanted to do kind of film scripts, and my first few years I was writing film scripts, and yeah, those were even worse than anything that any human being could have imagined. And I gave that up very quickly.
Where did you find your voice when you knew that this was, well, we never know, but when did you feel that this is good enough for me to send out to be published?
I didn't ever feel that, but I remember finding my voice when I remember writing a page that got thrown out of Drown, but that in some ways was the guiding spirit of it. And it'll go back in if I ever write another book, which was that you know how everybody now wants to claim like urban backgrounds? Whether it's the fact that like fashion, if you noticed in fashion, like if I show you a bunch of pictures of what women were dressed like in 1992, and I show you a bunch of pictures of women are dressed like now on every continent, fashion has been completely Latinized. Like all women are dressing like Latinas. For real. Don't make me bring the fucking slide projector out. You know?
Do you know that great quote of Truman Capote's, and he was being interviewed by Warhol, and Capote says, I really like Bianca Jagger, and Warhol, she has South American chic. And Warhol says, what's that? And Truman says, it's a Spanish adaptation of Negro culture.
That's, or how about just a Spanish continuation of Negro culture?
Yes.
Because most of the cultures that we're talking about are deeply Africanized.
Yes.
And so I remember this one page that got thrown out, which was...
Keep touching me, I like it.
Oh, you know. You know. It's like, I had this one page where I threw this thing out, which was, again, and that whole claim, you know, everybody's like, oh, I have family in the Bronx, or, oh, you know, my mom graduated from Brooklyn, or, you know, everybody's like now a New Yorker, you know? But I remember every time we would have to visit my family in the Bronx or in East New York, my siblings would beg not to go.
Right. Right.
We would be like, we do not want to fucking go. Right. Like, yo, this shit was hell. And I didn't want to go. You couldn't go outside. People would always menace us when we would go to the store. And I remember writing that page up and realizing that was so different from, say, anybody read that memoir, Fresh Off the Boat? The new one, Eddie Huang's, nobody's read that? That's like such a great, did you read it? Did you like it?
I read the first 20 pages before I gave it to my friend because she wanted it.
Honest man. All right, well, I won't use that as analysis. But again, there's been this whole tendency of like, everybody kind of wants to take on this hip urban culture, but I remember as kids, we were already part of that hip urban culture, and then we didn't want to get stuck in the fucking Bronx. Right. Like, we were so honest at 11 and 12, we're like, I don't want to go there. People like beat you up bad, and I suddenly, as soon as I had that scene, I knew I had nailed my New Jersey moment. Where we were black and Latino, we had no identity issues about that we weren't or were, but we did not want to fucking go to East New York. Right. And we were honest. It wasn't now where like everybody's like, yeah, my apartment, I'm on Pacific Ave, but you know, real deep, you know?
I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to go there either, and I grew up there.
You grew up there, bro. Right. Yeah, you know the deal.
Yeah.
I can always tell people who had like, we have a rule among my friends. You can always tell people who didn't have poor childhoods because they like talking about growing up poor. Right. You know, people with poor childhoods are like silent. Yeah. They're just like got nothing to say to anybody.
One of the things that beats so beautifully in Drown and in all of your work, again, goes back to this idea, he has to stand now, goes back to this idea of, I think if you're an artist, the hardest thing is to survive the people that you come from. And the people that you come from are the stories that you tell, often. Can you tell us a little bit about the family reaction to your first book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful thing. I mean, not a wonderful thing, but I think it's really honest question and statement and recognition. Again, I think depending on your childhood, if you had a childhood like mine, most of my friends had to protect their parents and the rest of us from their ambitions. You know, part of growing up with a certain background meant that you couldn't openly air your ambitions to people because, you know, it would have been an enormous threat. Right. And the first thing that you knew is that you would like, I've got to protect my parents from my ambition. And I guess when I think of it, I guess my family situation was always a heartbreaker, irregardless of any of the ways my career turned out. I think we were always so, you know, I think the family dynamic internalized all the kind of craziness of growing up. as an immigrant. I mean, there's so much, immigration is so difficult as it is, but probably the worst way to take it on the chin is to turn it against each other, you know, and
that's right.
It's weird, like, my family gets together, we get together almost never, my immediate family, and when we get together, it's always like a heartbreaker, like who's not talking to who, how like my two brothers live in California as far away from the rest of the family as possible. They want as little contact with the family, you know. There's like all this kind of awful stuff, and I'll be honest, I think my family barely tolerates me, and part of the barely tolerates me is that I should never speak about my art. That's like the price of admissions. If I want to go home and like sit through Christmas dinner and not have like kind of just melt down, I should never ever talk about it. And I'll lie, I'm a big old coward. I mean, I'll tell the truth. I'm a complete coward. It's like, guys, no matter who you are, like you can stand up to a whole bunch of different stuff. It's sometimes really hard. It's like, I'm still auditioning for my family's love. I don't, you know, I still hold out this kind of thing that like they'll be nicer, you know, if I play along. And I won't lie, there's days I go home to my family Christmas dinners and I will pay the price just because I'm hoping that people will be nice. Like, I'll admit it. It's like, guys, it's tough, man. Most of us, you wrestle with your family your whole life, and it's the people who don't. I think that's like the most blessed resource in the world, you know, because the rest of us are still like caught in a dynamic which doesn't always leave much room for you to be very compassionate to yourself because you're so busy trying to fit into a schemata where everybody's decided, if I'm shitty to you, I'll live better.
You know, what's profound though, Juno, is while that narrative is going on and it's deeply painful, you were able to be open enough and funny enough and friendly enough to find someone like me who was not so different, so we could make our own family.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is...
That's a declaration of love.
Yes. That was for the eternal photo shoot. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, those of us who have near misses as families, I think, you know, are like those of us who just yearn for families. You see that this thing can work. You know, if you grew up in New Jersey, again, Jersey people, anybody grew up around, if you grew up in New Jersey, chances are you grew up around Koreans, yeah? No, for real, I'm sorry. I grew up around Koreans. Why are you laughing? So I grew up around Koreans, and let me tell you something. If you guys know anything about that national history, that's a national history that it's like the Caribbean in a day. Right. You know, it's like compressed madness. And you realize it's like, I meet people when I was growing up whose families were the only reason they survived like 5 years of starvation. Right. And you get this sense that family can really work. And that family can do things for people that few other things can. Now, that's not just a fetishized family, because there are other relationships that can do the same thing. But I'm just arguing that when it works, it has some strengths. And so, of course, I'm a kid who's always looking for people that I could connect with profoundly. I mean, and I'm willing to take the risk. After you get kicked around enough, you two things. You either withdraw totally, or you say, well, I could take another kick. Right. You know, I was like, I could take another kick.
But also at the same time, but this might work.
This might work, especially because, come on, you're the fucking man. The thing about, yeah, it's true though.
Oh, can I tell them some jokes we told each other about fathers this Christmas?
Oh shit. Okay. I'm ready to hear these.
My favorite was Juno said, "Yo, your father was like my father. He would drive by the house in his car, and that was a visit."
Yes, it's so true.
It was really true, except my father didn't have the car.
Right. Yeah. Again, it's a Jersey thing. Right. With no train, motherfuckers start saving for their cars when they're 9.
Yes. Do you think that part of the struggle, all worth it for Oscar Wilde, was learning how to become a public figure while you were involved in this private occupation of writing?
Oh no, I mean, it's interesting. The best part of it is, again, guys, I wrote my first book. It was like, the sales to my first book will still convince any of you not to be a writer. It's awesome. You know, in fact, my sales of Oscar Wilde would convince most of you not to be writers, to be honest. You know, so my thing is that I published my first book, and it got some notoriety among fiction wonks. There's people who were into fiction, public school teachers, for real, and fucking Dominicans and, you know, and allies. You know, so the Puerto Rican community, Cuban community, the Chicano community, that was it. And so really that was it. And so I had this great thing where I wrote a book in 1996, and then that was it. I spent the next 11 years having like no career. And I remember it's like I had like a 6-year period where I didn't publish even like a minor essay, you know? And it was awesome because, you know, I got this little burst of attention, and then I proceeded to lose whatever. Like when I hear my students talking, my students have all this professional language. They're all ready to be famous. So they're like, yeah, you lost all your momentum. Okay, that's what we had. So part of it, no. Part of it was, part of the experience of Oscar Wilde was outweighing my desire to sound like my student. In other words, I didn't want to hear myself saying, you've got to publish this fast, you've got momentum. Okay. Strike while people know who you are. Hey, this would be great time. If you wrote a really great novel now, as opposed to any time, you know? And I remember spending at least 5 years just waiting for that voice to die. For real, I was writing the whole time, but I didn't write anything useful till that voice died. So that voice no longer had control of the board, where it was no longer saying, do this fast or do this well. When I finally heard the voice go, well, you should just write the fucking bad book that you knew you were going to write because you suck. I was like, go. You know? For real.
You press play then.
It was go.
Yes.
And it's the same thing. I mean, it took 16 years. You know, bears repetition. It took 16 years for This Is How You Lose Her to get done. And This Is How You Lose Her, 16 years, because I had to keep wrestling with that voice. I had to wait for the moments that voice died so that I could write the next chapter. And then if it would flare up, and then I wouldn't be able to work on the book again.
There are other voices that intrude into your life in beautiful ways. We had gone to see the Central Park 5 documentary, and we were walking down 6th Avenue, and all of a sudden I heard 3 girls screaming. And I just thought, oh, it's New York and people are crazy, and I kept walking, but Juno heard them say Juno. And the girl came up, it was like being with the Beatles, it was so exciting.
Come on, and, come on, man.
But it was beautiful, and she said, Juno, I've been waiting for you for so long, and your new book is out, and I'm so happy for you.
But that was, yes, but that was also Dominican shit. That was like, for real. That was that, I mean, yeah, no, thank you.
Can you take that voice?
Nah.
Okay.
Nah, because I don't think some of us guys, everybody got their engine for why they work. And I think that the engine that propels me is the engine that doesn't want to be anybody's friend. And doesn't want popularity, doesn't want, honestly, I'm not joking, guys, I'm not that bad a writer. I can write a short story collection in under 16 years, like, you know what I mean? This is not, you may trust me when I tell you there's nothing wrong with my craft. It's just that none of those other voices produce the horrifying, deceptive intimacy that I need to tell my stories.
Right.
You know, there has to be this voice, there has to be a presence in the book that wants to tell the truth, because by telling the truth, it reduces your faith and like for them, and by extension, me. Like, I guess I grew up in a post-dictatorship society. And anyone who's grown up in a post-dictatorship society knows that the axis of like is how dictatorships survive. Mm-hmm. Becoming popular is part of what dictatorships hijack to keep themselves in power, you know? And so for me to write things from the same toxic axis that made the dictatorship that completely disfigured my family and my society, it just wasn't going to happen, because my father was a Dominican military police apparatchik. He not only was emblematic of that culture, but he almost somatized it. And I lived in that culture where it was like so much better to be liked because your shirt was ironed, and to be liked because you had a good posture, and to be, it was just insane the way a military dictatorship is like Reddit. You just, honestly, man.
So something like The Autumn of the Patriarch is a work of realism.
Unfortunately, and I think Autumn of the Patriarch doesn't begin to get at, because it takes the sort of, it takes the twilight of it.
The quiet.
And the thing is that my experience of living in a post-dictatorship society is that everybody believes they're going to be the Reddit article that gets pushed all the way up. You know, that's this constant, just this, the like axis is just very, very powerful. And so I just needed to just tilt a different way. I needed to say, is it possible to say things, to be involved in a conversation with people where our relationship was determined by things more complicated than whether you like me or not? Maybe the content of my communication would be in itself worthy of discussion, irregardless of how you felt at an emotional level with the person bringing the news. And in dictatorships, the two things get quickly put together. They're like, the news you bring is a moral judgment about you. And this is the way you keep critics silent. Because you basically say, if you criticize the dictatorship, it's not only your thinking, your body is out of order. And this is why we must destroy your body.
So this writing is an act of defiance in the home and in the world.
This is the way I understand it. It's like a self-aggrandizing lunacy that helps me understand like why I wait so long and why I hear that voice so clearly. And I'm so desirous. I myself, maybe part of it is because I was so desirous to want to play along with that with my father. I knew if I ironed my clothes every day, my father would like me really well. But my dad made a mistake and took me to the military prisons in the Dominican Republic that he worked in. And his games with me and my little brother, my big brother, was putting us in the cells and pretending to lock the doors and walk away. And I remember, I remember my brother thinking this was the funniest thing. And I just remember like looking around at the feces-covered walls and thinking, we are now in the space of this culture. Like, even though I didn't have the language for it then, I knew this was home. Like, my dad was taking me to work, but he was also taking me home. And I think that had a profound, that created in me a kind of a deep visceral desire to attack a different way.
Right.
Because that's not the home I wanted to end up at.
Right. So
I was trying to figure out, how do I, despite the fact that I probably would have happily set up a torture prison if my dad would have loved me, just thinking about like, how could I, even with that impulse, how could I have pulled away? I don't know.
How did you build your own home?
I think part of it is what you identified, was in a family like mine where, listen, how many, again, it's hard to describe my family without seeming completely made up. But in my family, how many fights you won in the leisurely arranged boxing matches between all the kids in our neighborhood, and how many bullets you nailed to the innard of the target during our Saturday rifle range outing. In our family, that got you love. And so my escape from that weird regime was trying to read. It was weird. It's like being a nerd was an act of like escape in my family, because everything else was like shoot guns and get punched by your neighbors. You know?
And I think that because I know you have to do this other stuff here tonight, but just to say that the reading as an act of aggression and salvation, parents who don't read, who don't have any access to that stuff, often think of it, the child is putting up a wall.
Oh yeah.
And they're not agreeing with them.
Yeah.
But they can't say it's wrong.
They're so caught in the Enlightenment bond, right? Yeah. Bind. Where your parents know, especially if they're immigrants, that the only way out of this immigrantness is education. Right. In their minds. That's the general kind of trope. But at the same time, I know this probably happened with you. When my family would see me with a book, they would be like, you know, abnormal, go outside and play.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So there was like this back and forth, and I figure as a kid you find spaces where there's at least a back and forth that you can hide between.
I hid. My mother used to take us to the Liberation Bookshop in downtown Brooklyn, and it was a sort of black-owned shop, and you would get things like Gwendolyn Brooks, and that was the treat at Christmas time. And so I found a picture of Frederick Douglass that I put on my wall, and she said, oh, isn't it, I heard her on the phone with one of her friends, and she said, oh, isn't it wonderful, he's so interested in history, and here's a picture of Frederick Douglass on the wall, but she had no idea why I had a picture of Frederick Douglass on the wall. And now that I get to look like Frederick Douglass, I'm even happier.
Oh, that's brilliant.
I love you, Junot.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Hilton.
for having us. Okay. The charming Miss the charming Miss Strand has asked Junot to take 4 questions.
From the audience.
From the audience.
Hi. So this question has to do with This Is How You Lose Her. And one of the chapters you have in there.
Hey, you're Rutgers?
Yeah.
Yay! My alma mater. What's up, Rutgers? That's my shit.
Right, so we read your book for one of my classes, but one of the topics of discussion was why you included the chapter with the women who worked at the laundromat and how we read that in the context of the book.
Wait a minute, are you doing a paper?
I'm not.
Okay. Just checking. It's so, damn. Yeah, you know, I kind of, again, because I know this sounds completely ridiculous, but because the persona who writes my books is a writer writing my books. You know what I mean? And so Junior is like, writes all my books first. And so you have to understand Junior, you have to understand the books as being filtered first through this dude who's like a big liar. And also who's way smarter than I am. Because you know you can write smarter people than you. That's easy. You know, like you guys know, you just look this shit up, right? So, Junior's smarter than me, and one of the things about Junior is that he loves to destabilize a reader's sense of who he is and who his family is. And he loves breaking up any kind of authoritative narrative about his family or himself. And so that he will actually tell different versions of a story. And so you have, in my first book, Drown, you have a version of the story where his father abandons the family and goes and lives in the United States, the story called Negocios. This is a second iteration of the story, told from the point of view of the woman who his father almost leaves the family with. And so he keeps the father's name, but changes everything around. Because in this way, it's like hard to tell which story is true. You know, because Junior is so not about true. You know, and again, and this comes to the first, and it's not just something that's to make up stuff, because in Drown, we see in Drown that this is already bolted into the book. So that in Drown, the first book, you see Junior describe his brother and his brother's relationship in great detail and then stop talking about it.
Right.
Yeah?
Right.
And so in Junior, there's like this complete silence about where the brother goes. You get the new book, This Is How You Lose Her, and suddenly you realize that the brother has died of cancer. And that the brother had been dead of cancer in the first book, but it had been completely left out of the first book because I always assumed this book would come. And this book would explain the first book, but it would also destabilize the first book. So that story is Junior telling his, what would be called his family's foundational myth again. And if I ever write my next book in this series, Junior will tell that story again. And he kind of doesn't, I kind of believe that, especially those of us who grew up in immigrant families, the foundational story takes on this luminous glow. It takes on its own authority, except it's completely fictitious, because if you pay attention, the story doesn't ever cohere. There's always stuff that doesn't come together. People always switch their narratives. So I guess that's, I know, right? Sorry.
I just wrote her paper.
No, she's not writing a paper. I know, isn't that a terrible answer?
No.
Hi. Ooh, that's loud. Okay, so as an immigrant, I also am trying to kind of write the stories of immigrants, and I wanted to know, as a fiction writer, did you ever kind of worry about, you said that the world that you wrote about was specifically your own. Did you ever worry about misrepresenting kind of the immigrant experience and
No.
No?
Well, but I'm saying, if you're not, listen, people want to read stories by quote unquote marginal artists as universal, in the exact wrong way we want them to be read. Yeah? I want to be read at Universal not because this stands in for all Dominicans and therefore this is a great map for any of you who are going to the Dominican Republic, you know? This is not about, this story is about one tiny dot in that shifting constellation of people and moments and identities that we would call the Dominican diaspora. I'm not claiming to represent anyone but this tiny group of people. I mean, why do you think I create a character like Oscar, who is absolutely fits no formula of what is a Dominican? He spends his whole time being like, no, really, I'm Dominican. And everybody's like, no, you're not. And in some ways, I guess he was an argument for this is the way our art is. All art, because it scales to the human, should immediately, because of that human level distortion, disqualify itself from becoming a stand-in for a nation or a people or a time. There's something about the granular complexity about any novel or short story collection which almost seems to immediately invalidate it as a larger argument about this group or this people. And so if you understand that complexity, you shouldn't get worried. I think that we only worry about this because we ourselves sometimes, I'm not saying you, we ourselves sometimes want to claim partially that we're spokespeople for our nation. Por abajo, in the lower frequencies where we don't like to admit things, we really truly want to be the writer of our generation or the writer of our people, of our moment. And I think that that's what leads us all astray. You know, because on one hand, we don't want to be called out for that, but on the other hand, we want all the banners and prizes and privileges that come with that. You know, and I think that it's a terrible, terrible two-headed dragon to serve. I think you should just immediately disqualify yourself from being the writer of your generation, your nation, and people, and write what you need to fucking write, which will be useful to no one, we hope. You know? I mean, that's the best art, is like, seems utterly disposable, right? And it has its way of reminding us that it's the exact opposite, yeah? Yeah, I guess I don't worry about that. I always grew up so far away from what was called normal. Yeah. I mean, it's hilarious. People will be like, I feel this so strongly. I read your work. People, like 2 people have told me, like, this speaks to me. And I'm like, I barely speaks to me. I'm really happy, you know? So 2 more.
I have so many things I want to say, but obviously I can't. First of all, I am a Rutgers College graduate.
Oh, RC.
When Rutgers College was College Avenue. But in any event, I'm wondering, you describe this deprivation you grew up with and these, forgive me, crazy role models, which, forgive me again for being white, but that is a universal experience in many ways. But in any event, how do you explain the fact that you succeeded so beautifully and didn't succumb to all the other things that could have happened to you and didn't follow all these dysfunctional paths?
But who says it hasn't? I mean, I just think.
Oh, come
no,
on.
But wait a second. No, but wait a second. I'm not just being tendentious. I just think that this is the mythography of America. That we just love to think of that the American mythography is progressive. This idea that everything moves upward and people are always on this journey to improvement and how did you make it? Listen, guys, this is very important to understand, is that I don't speak the language of make it, because you well know that our instance, our moment in late capital has no problems through its contradictions, occasionally granting someone, ridiculous moments of privilege. Yeah, but that's not what matters. In other words, we can elect Obama, but what does that say about the fate of the African American community? We have no problem in this country rewarding individuals of color momentarily as a way never to address structural cannibalistic inequalities that are faced by the communities these people come out of. So I'm like, and the record ain't done yet. Last time I checked, has anybody tabulated my full account of cruelties towards people? No, like, I just mean it. Like, I don't think we can safely say just because someone has some sort of visible markers of success that in any way they have avoided any of the dysfunctions. That is that kind of Chaucerian weird physiognomy as like moral status. I just think that, in fact, none of us, we don't know anything about anybody. Certainly, like, I think that, yes, I have made a certain level of status as an artist and as a writer, but what I'm reminded most acutely is not of my quote-unquote awesomeness or some sort of will to power that has led me through the jungle or the maze. What I'm aware of being here is that I am representative of a structural exclusion. That room is made for ones so that room does not have to be made for the manys. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm really aware of. Yeah? So,
plus who's to say we're not crazy?
That's what I was trying to say earlier. I know I'm fucking nuts.
Yeah.
You know?
One more?
Is there somebody, wait a minute, first of all, have we heard from any Dominicans at all? I want to hear from one Dominican before I go out. ¿Tú tienes una ahí? Okay. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be like that, but I feel like I've got Jersey covered. No, for real, if Jersey hadn't been here, I need to hear from Jersey.
Yeah. How did you know that I was from Jersey and I'm Dominican?
Oh, I got a 2 for 1. She's an artist also. Oh, shit, and an artist.
I wouldn't admit it, though. I guess what I'm wondering is, I'm sure you felt some sort of displacement within society and especially your own culture. How did you overcome that? What did you have to...
But again, I don't think these are not myths. I think we accept too much at face value these ideologies of transcendence. that one overcomes their, I mean, I guess my first thing was I noticed nobody was at home. This idea that some of us are less at home than others, that's a big fucking laugh. I think some of us have better operational masquerades than others. But last time I noticed, you know, America isn't epically addicted to cocaine, especially white upper class America, because it feels at home. Because it feels comfortable in its own fucking skin. Because it feels like in its place. Yeah, I just think that it's just that some of our displacements are pathologized in ways that other people's displacements are. Yeah, so that we try to explain everything, it's because we're immigrants or we're of color. Because that's the way the society explains everything. Right? If I tomorrow blow up a building, it'll be like, fucking an immigrant. Right? Because that's the easy go-to myth. I just think that for me, I quickly realized that from everything I saw that there is no transcending the human experience. That there is just, you've got to fucking realize that most of us, and I'm just saying this to leave room for some superhumans out there, most of us feel permanently displaced. Most of us feel savagely undone. Most of us try everything we can to manage our fears and our insecurities. Most of us are profoundly inhuman to ourselves and other people, and that makes us no more valuable, no more worthy of attention and love. And my thing is that I didn't transcend all these stuff. I just am like, you gotta live with them, man. And I think that there's nothing like trying to run away from all that stuff to guarantee their supremacy.
Right.
My idea is to try to change at least the percentage of the vote.
Right.
These voices are always going to get a vote, but do they always have to have the majority of the vote?
They don't get to win all the time.
Yeah, man. Right. So it's just like you try to distribute who you are in different proportions, but the transcendence myth, I think, will just do you in the long run.
Did you ever see that extraordinary moment on Oprah, and Toni Morrison's son had just died, and she said, Oprah says, I'm very sorry to hear about your son, but now you have closure.
Oh, Oprah.
And the camera mistakenly went to Toni's face.
Right.
And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. I'll be sad for the rest of my life.
Oh, yeah.
And this idea of the arrival myth is what you're speaking of, that once we arrive, but one of the great and amazing things about America and Americans is that they never do.
No. And tomorrow, listen, guys, my first reading was at Boston, attended by one person. Yeah, my best friend, Shuya Ono. Yeah? That was my first reading, and that was about my first 20 readings. Yeah? Today, all these fine faces here, and I really appreciate the support for me and Hilton, but tomorrow, you're back to one person. America is not like Latin America, that tends to be much more committed to its artists. Yeah, that you could be 30 years in the game and not publish one book and people are still like, yo, you matter. Guys, we are a fickle, fickle nation. And today's arrival is tomorrow's. See, I told you, what a fraud. And somebody will come along and that's the reality of it. This is not, I love you guys and I appreciate you being here, but if this is why you're doing your art, you're in for a lot of pain. A lot of pain. Guys, I see you. I'm trying to be here 100% for you because you made your night out. You know, like really be present. But at the same time, I know that I'm back to reading to my boy Shuya, always in my heart. Because that's the place where most of us end up as artists. And you gotta be comfortable there, man. No matter what your fantasies of supremacy and a success are, because tomorrow that's where you'll be at. And it's okay. I forgive you the way I forgive myself for being human and not producing what will keep you famous and rich. It's like none of us can equal that. And it's absolutely okay. You know, the best part about art is that as long as the civilization survives, somebody out there will keep one copy of your text, perhaps, and perhaps that will give comfort, inspiration, and more importantly, a space for an individual to be in touch with their humanity, to be temporarily in touch with their best selves, which is fragile, flawed, weak, scared, and that's all we can ask for in art. And I think that that's what's worth working for, and it's worth preserving. And I think that's the moment why most of us go this very long, shadowed path into producing this art, because we fundamentally believe that what we do is the best of what we call human, the best of us, even if at times we don't like to recognize it.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Junot.